Today's show is live from REWBCON in St. Louis. The theme of the conference was community, and this is something that, from my perspective, we don't talk about enough in the real estate industry. Community is just so important, not only for our business, but also for our well being. In this episode, I'll talk about some data on the impact of community in our lives and share how you can get more involved. Before we get into the live from REWBCON segment, I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about community. And the theme of the conference this year was community and what that can do for us as real estate investors and how we can contribute to that wider community around us as we progress through the real estate field. And so, if we think about why community is so important, one of the typical things that comes up all the time is, support, the peer group aspect, the fact that it's bad to do things in isolation. We learn quicker in groups. There's obviously also networking aspects. So if you're part of a community, that's what is a community? It's basically a network of people who gather together for some kind of purpose or for some kind of reason. And as you do that, there's this kind of natural evolution that happens as those relationships form into this kind of like a web, like a kind of a spider web that ends up supporting all the individual points on that. And if you're doing this for the purpose of business, evidently that's going to translate into better deals, into better connections, into just being part of the fabric of that particular community in an area. As an individual that's part of that, like, it's definitely clear that there's significant upside to that. Obviously, we're in the real estate field. People are looking for market intelligence and getting into deals. And so if you're part of a community that exchanges ideas and exchanges information, this is going to support the decision making that you're able to do and the qualities of deals that you're able to find. It's also going to give you perhaps some inside intelligence on how different markets are evolving, how the sort of national climate around you is evolving, and how to be able to position yourself despite some of the other outside conditions that are going to be taking place. And that's just as simple as, having a conversation about how someone solved a particular problem or how someone is structuring deals in whatever conditions are happening. But these are kind of the typical things that come up when we talk about the value of community in real estate. But I wanted to just address two other aspects that I find often kind of get neglected. And, the first of those is kind of a reputational aspect. And, I'll give you this parallel. I obviously have a martial arts background. And so, in the martial arts world, it's a very small world in whatever city you happen to be in. And so you will find that the various gyms are connected and the teachers in those gyms know each other. Maybe some athletes cross train, maybe people compete against each other. And so it's really a very small world. And what is a double-edged sword in a world like that is that information gets around and people's reputations end up preceding them. Real estate community is no different. And by, kind of being part of a community fabric, that allows you to do some of that deep reputational vetting of people that, if you're integrated into something where somebody's been transacting or behaving in that world for, 10 years, 5 years, whatever time period it is, that community is going to have, an opinion of that particular person. There's going to be the accumulation of their behaviors that have been tracked by that group over, a significant time period. And so that's really important in terms of trying to make good connections. And, we're in a business where there's a lot of money circulating, a lot of people behave ethically, some perhaps behave less ethically. There might also be people who are, more known for taking than giving. And when you are plugged into a community, those kind of reputational bits of information are going to be available to you if you're listening sort of to what's being said and to what's happening. Then the other aspect of community that I find we unfortunately don't address very much is the bigger conversation about what's going on in our culture in a wider sense. And that is that, these modern kind of post-industrial information age that we live in has been very corrosive of some of those more traditional communities that have kind of anchored our well-being socially over the history of humanity, really. And whether that is a kind of a geographic erosion. So we can talk about the erosion of neighborhoods. If I think of my grandparents, they grew up in a, small town in Austria, and nobody in that family moved more than 5 kilometers outside of that town, including my parents' generation, except for, my father who then emigrated to Canada. But that kind of, close knit community where neighborhood, local community where everybody knows everybody and there's this kind of a social fabric that exists is extremely important for human well-being. And if we think of some of the other aspects of community that are maybe more like post-industrial, you could think of labor unions, churches, wider families, any community network that we mention. If you think about traditionally the role that that community played, they have been very eroded. And as much as some of these things were already kind of in dissolution, COVID was extremely destructive of communities. And, again, I refer back to my examples are the martial arts world and the real estate world. And, after 3 years of being in lockdown and having those communities basically taken apart because we couldn't meet physically, some of it went online, but that's just not the same experience as it is to, be going out and having that face-to-face energy and interaction with people, building those relationships in person, and then feeling you're part of some kind of social fabric, which is just so key to human well-being. And, actually, in terms of some of the mental health statistics, like I think we're all aware that, our societies now are kind of at a low point in terms of, mental health, anxiety, depression, addiction, those kind of manifestations of, indicators of negative mental health that's happening. And one of the main factors that is sort of thought to be contributing to this is specifically that lack of community. I actually had the opportunity to read a book called Chasing the Scream not too long ago, which is really a book all about addictions. But, in addition to like things like trauma and, other kind of emotional disturbances, lack of community is one of the main predictors of people falling into depression and developing various kinds of other negative social manifestations. So I think in how we think about how we're living our lives beyond simply real estate, the aspect of community is definitely not to be underestimated. And being part of this real estate community, like if you were to just sit and think about, where do communities exist? Where can you find communities now? Because it's not immediately evident, like outside of, let's say, your work or your family, maybe your immediate family, if you're not connected to a larger family network. Where do you plug into communities? If you're part of a church or a mosque, obviously something will be gravitating around that, maybe school or work. But beyond that, if you're, not practicing a particular sport, how can you insert yourself into a social fabric that's going to basically give, support and meaning to your life? That's worth giving some thought to. And so, luckily, as people who practice real estate, who are, investors, there are thriving real estate communities. There are communities that exist at the national level. There are communities that exist at the local level. And, certainly for myself in Montreal with my coaching company called Equity Builders, we have monthly networking events. And part of the goal of that is to create that community feeling for the people who are locally close to us. And obviously, this then positively affects our business. But, when I come out of those community events, like I just feel so uplifted. And part of it is because we're all passionate about real estate, but part of it is also just because you're, just like Cheers used to be, you go somewhere where everybody knows your name. And that is just kind of very, humanly soothing and important in terms of our personal well-being. So obviously, being able to go to, a larger international conference, for me, I'm Canadian, so heading down to REWBCON in the States is an international journey for me. For people who are, either Canadian and looking at going to pan-Canadian conferences, or who are in the US looking at going to kind of those like more nationwide conferences, there is also a utility to that. And I'm going to, get to that a little bit later on in the episode, just to, kind of point out some of the importance of being locally connected and then being connected to those wider people, in terms of seeing what are the best practices. Because certainly for me in Montreal, like sometimes in our local market, things have a tendency to be a little bit, provincial or a little bit behind. And if you want to find out some of those cutting edge things, you want to be connected to really high level people who have that bird's eye view of what's going on. Sometimes going, internationally or moving outside of your small local market can really be very eye-opening and inspiring. So, just to talk about some ways that you can become involved in a community, obviously, if you're local to us in Montreal, we would love to have you come out to some of our monthly events. You can find those on our website, which is in the show notes. We would love to have you be part of our local community. But if you are not local to me, definitely in whatever market you're in, you should check out sites like Facebook, like Meetup, like Eventbrite, and try to plug yourself into some of that, local vibe, some of those networks of people that exist in those markets, just to allow you to build that kind of community around yourself. Now, if you happen to not have that in your local area, perhaps you're, in a smaller place where there is not this community, real estate community locally that exists, go ahead and start one. And I can tell you very candidly, when, I got started, I just created a meetup and I started having monthly meetups where you advertise what's the subject going to be. Sometimes I had a speaker, sometimes it was just networking. But the fact of, reuniting people on a monthly basis means that you get this kind of core of people who keeps coming back again and again. And over time, those relationships build and they become more than just business connections that you refer business to. They become part of that social fabric into which us as humans just feel better when we can kind of insert ourselves into there. So I want to, just before we dive into the material that was recorded live at REWBCON, I want to just spend a little bit of time talking about, why first, as Canadians and Americans, what the value is of attending conferences like that. So if you're Canadian, you should tune into this now and you should listen to why it's a good idea to attend American conferences, even if you're not necessarily right now investing in the US. And, REWBCON is a great example of this because, the size of the American market and the quality of the speakers, the level at which people are playing the game in that environment is going to be just so inspiring. And if you want to go to business Harvard, definitely check out some American conference. I love REWBCON. I will obviously be there next year. So that's a great place to start. And, it's also in terms of thinking what the values of that community are and how is it going to be supporting you. That's also something that you kind of want to put a little bit of thought into. And when you attend events, you will quickly get the vibe of how invested is that particular community in your individual success and how much is it invested in perhaps the success of the organizers or in creating sponsorship deals or selling something. And, definitely the way to sort of triangulate that is to talk to other people or kind of hear what the word on the street is about particular events. If you're, looking at attending maybe only one or two conferences per year, you want to make sure that you're picking an event that is going to give you the maximum benefit of that time spent. And so definitely do your homework, do some due diligence, speak to people who've already been to events and ask them what are the best things to attend and what should I not miss? What conferences could I maybe pass on? And that's always a great way to sort of decide amongst the plethora of things that are available. Now, if you're an American listener and you have not enjoyed the little blah blah for Canadians, why attend a big national conference like REWBCON? Getting out of, your local headspace and networking with some of those other investors who are, playing the game at a higher level can be super constructive. It's also, I want to come back to this idea of, the support and the values of that conference or of that meetup group or whatever kind of thing you're a part of. And in selecting what you want to give your membership time to, really think about, what the values of that community are and whether or not it's invested in its individual members, or is it something that's been created either just purely to be monetized or to feed the sponsors or to perhaps the egos of the organizers, because there's definitely some of that out there. So without further ado, let's step into the material that was recorded live on REWBCON. You're going to hopefully get some of that energy, get some of the excitement that I was able to experience while I was down there, and hear a little bit more about how you can join a community and what the value of some of that perspective is that you can gain from being part of a community event. So this is one of my favorite things to do, which is to record a podcast at a live event. This is the second time I'm attending REWBCON and the second time that I have the privilege to record a live episode here for you guys directly from a conference where I get to soak up all the cool energy. And I just wanted to share one experience that I had this morning, which was really fun. So, we have all these great conversations like what's your favorite breakfast food, find 3 things you have in common with people. And right after discussing with a group of American investors down here about what my favorite breakfast food was, I discovered that they were calling me milk in a bag, because in Canada we can buy milk in a bag. And yes, that's the truth. And then one of the people asked me, so what do you miss the most about Canada? And I was like, you know what, off the top of my mind, nothing at the moment. And then that kind of got me thinking. And, as I was thinking about some of the differences between our two countries and some of the differences in terms of investing, which I want to get into a little bit later, is that one of the things about Canada that is interesting is our social spectrum is super compressed compared to the US. And that's like, in a country where you have more regulations and more kind of social programs, what happens is there's just less of a bandwidth between rich and poor. And so like, coming into conference this morning, like the kind of wealth and the kind of things that you can see in the US are just not the same to the kind of things that you can see in Canada in terms of your social spectrum. And that then brings me to investing. And one of the things that's so interesting about the differences between our two countries is just that investing environment is very different. And if I had to talk about what it boils down to a difference in leverage. Now, I've had tons of American guests on. I have the privilege of talking to tons of American investors. And we off camera joke about how America is the land of unlimited debt opportunity, unlimited debt options. And, that is actually very true. In Canada, we have 5 major banks, and we have to put a lot of money down, a lot of cash into our deals in order to make them work because our banking industry is so regulated. Now, why do I talk about this main difference? Because I really want perhaps more advanced investors, people who are thinking about de-risking their portfolios on both sides of the border, to have a think about this. Because if you're Canadian, what you should be hearing is that south of the border, there is this ecosystem in which you can go much further, much faster, because there's more opportunities in terms of what you can do with your debt leverage. So it's possible to get debt service ratios on residential properties, multiple residential properties. So that would be 3 doors and less for us Canadians. And that just allows you to be able to scale faster. Now, the other thing, and this is where I'm going to get to you Americans who might be listening to this and thinking, what might the opportunities be for investing in Canada? Well, I'll tell you right now, Canada did not have 2008. And why did we not have 2008? Because our banking system and our leverage system just works in such a different way. And how does this translate on the ground? Well, in the States, the statistic is 1 in 20 real estate sales is a foreclosure. In Canada, that statistic is 1 in 900. And what pushes that higher number of foreclosures to happen is specifically the way in which people are able to leverage deals, leverage their money. And so, I would think that a great opportunity would be to be able to sit out the next economic crisis. And that goes for American investors as much as it does for Canadians, but specifically in an environment where there is more leverage and people are able to fly kind of more fast and loose with the amount of deals that they're doing. The fact that just north of here is Canada, in which we have just a more stable banking environment. Yes, you do need more money to play in that particular game, but this brings me to the next thing. So the other joke when, my American friend this morning was asking me, what are the things that you miss about Canada? Well, I definitely don't miss the exchange rate, because I was joking, for us, when we come down here, it's 25 cents Canadian or $1 American for us to buy that. It's like the exchange rate is just very bad for us. And so basically, like, that also means that even if a Canadian deal might require more cash down, the fact is that because the American dollar is just so strong compared to many other currencies, if you have not had a chance to think about what things might look at in terms of cross-border investing, you would be able to get much more bang for your buck if you look outside of your home environment. And so I actually didn't mean for this episode to turn into a bit of a missive on diversification, which is turned into, but I think in reflecting on what you get out of coming to some of these conferences after being able to participate in an event like REWBCON is you get to be around other people who ask you thoughtful questions. You get to be around people who are doing things, who have encountered problems that you have not met before in your practice, in your real estate practice, whatever it might be. And there might be solutions there before you even are able to formulate the problem properly. And just a funny story, this whole debt leverage, what got me thinking about this is almost 6 weeks ago when I was hanging out with another group of investors at PodFest, one of my colleagues asked me, Terrie, why should I invest in Canada when I can make more money in the US? Tell me, what does a typical deal look like to you? And so, I told him about my typical deal, and he just really wasn't very excited. He's like, that cash flow is just way less interesting than what I can do on my typical deal here. And then plus there's the whole red tape of doing things cross border. And like, that really bothered me. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to walk away from this and really think about like, how am I going to find an answer to that? I have a feeling that there is an answer, but I wasn't able to come up with it at the time. And so then just the fact of stepping away from that, having another conversation with the same investor this morning to be able to say, look, I've now found the answer to that question. And the answer to that question is it's a matter of diversification, and it's a matter of being able to potentially sit out the next financial crisis that we are not able to predict. And, no matter which ecosystem, which environment, which market you're investing in, if you have the possibility to sit out the potential next, shaking of the financial markets, would you not take that opportunity? And that becomes when maybe, cross-border investing or that's another form of diversification. We had a presentation this morning on investing in gold, looking at like different asset classes that allow you to spread your risk by diversifying, and definitely different national ecosystems are a great way to do that. So like I said, this is really, fun and exciting to get to do a live podcast episode live from REWBCON, live from a conference, to be able to share the energy and the cool stuff that you get out of coming to these events and just being around a whole bunch of other people that are passionate about real estate investing and that have maybe cracked some of those difficult equations that you just haven't had a chance to encounter yet.